The Jets of 2024, most colossal and embarrassing failures in sports history, and that sticks to all of them.
They were going to trade for Jerry Jeudy, who I think has 1,000 receiving yards for the Browns. They were going to trade with the Broncos, and then Woody Johnson, I think, found out from his sons that Jerry Jeudy didn't have a good Madden rating.
The New York Jets are one of the oldest running jokes in professional sports. They're known as a perennial failure, a team that will find a way to snatch defeat from the jaws of success. And for the most part, the joke is entirely true. Or is it? In 2025, the New York Jets have once again failed at the hands of Aaron Rodgers and Joe Douglas. But was it really their fault? Are the Jets historically as bad as people say they are? Whose fault is the failure of the Jets both historically and currently? But more importantly, what does an 18-year-old Harvard freshman tennis player have to do with the current failings of the New York Jets? Before we get to the content, we are starting a baseball channel called Uni Diamond Talk. We're giving away 10 copies of MLB The Show to a subscriber that turns on their notifications on that channel. I'll leave a link to it in the description down below now that we get all that out of the way. Mic check 1 2 1 2. What's going on, everybody? Before we tackle the modern New York Jets, we have to turn the clock back about 62 years to 1963, back when the New York Jets actually played in New York City, Shea Stadium to be exact. The New York franchise had finally changed their name from the Titans to the Jets to honor the city's new LaGuardia Airport. Or if you ask former Jets owner Sonny Werblin, it was literally because Jets rhymed with Mets and it was good marketing. A few years later in 1965, the Jets changed everything by drafting Joe Namath second overall in the AFL draft, and history would be made. As we all know, Joe Namath wasn't just a quarterback, but he was an icon. Broadway Joe was the mascot of New York City, and for the first time in history, the Jets weren't little brothers to the Giants. They were actually the premier football team of New York City.
You were talking about the team.
Yeah, what team?
The team that you were supposed to be with.
Oh! Anyway, we got a good team.
Another in-depth analysis from Joe Namath.
It certainly also helped that just a few years after drafting Namath in 1968, the Jets won the third Super Bowl ever played. But just 2 years later in 1970, the AFL-NFL merger occurred, meaning that the Jets were now direct competitors of the New York Giants. This was the golden age of Jets football. They had championship bragging rights over their crosstown rivals. Their quarterback was the icon of the league and pop culture, and there was no going down from here. I mean, hell, they even drafted future Hall of Fame running back John Riggins in the first round of the 1971 NFL Draft, who notoriously won Super Bowl MVP and brought the team another Super Bowl championship. Wait, actually, no, that was actually the Washington Redskins. Because after 4 years with the Jets, they chose not to re-sign Riggins, and instead, he went to the Redskins, where he would firmly cement his Hall of Fame status. But more on that later. Unfortunately, as a matter of fact, it actually was entirely downhill from here. From 1970 to 1980, the New York Jets did not finish with a record over 500 a single time. They made pivotal mistakes like in 1978 when they drafted tackle Chris Ward 4th overall, just a few picks ahead of future Hall of Famer James Lofton. In 1980, the Jets took Lam Jones 2nd overall ahead of Anthony Munoz, who is arguably the greatest offensive tackle of all time, who was selected 1 pick later. They took him over Art Monk as well, who was also drafted in the first round. Munoz and Monk would go on to become Hall of Famers, while Jones played 5 seasons in the NFL, never eclipsing the 800-yard mark. Now, it's honestly kind of unfair to blame it entirely on drafting though. Over that same time period, the team drafted Mark Gastineau, the franchise's all-time leader in sacks, and Richard Todd, a solid Joe Namath replacement, but that's it. They missed out on Hall of Famer after Hall of Famer, and in return got decent but not great players. The 1980s were slightly better. Sure, they didn't win their division a single time, but they actually had good teams. During the 1982 strike season, the Jets finished the season 6-3, and actually made it all the way to the AFC Championship game against a pre-Marino Dolphins team. But in classic Jets fashion, the team laid a goose egg and lost the game 14-0. Remember that John Riggins guy? The running back that that the Jets drafted and didn't re-sign, yeah, he ended up winning Super Bowl MVP this season and led the Redskins to a championship against the Dolphins. So I think it's pretty safe to say this season probably would have ended up differently if the Jets didn't just let a Hall of Famer walk in free agency. For reference, here's just how good Riggins was.
I hit Riggins one time on a slant. Golly, the sky just went whoosh. He was just such a big load. He was Derrick Henry for that time.
After that, it was back to mediocrity for the Jets. After losing that conference championship game in the 1982 season, the Jets would win one playoff game in the next 15 years. One playoff win in 15 seasons. We talk a lot about the sadness of the Las Vegas Raiders, the failure of the Jacksonville Jaguars, or even the pitifulness of the Chicago Bears. The only franchise that comes close to the Jets in terms of despair and failure is the Cleveland Browns. There are countless absurdly funny stories from this 15-year period, and if I were to tell you all of them, then this video would probably be 5 hours long. So let me tell you my favorite. In 1993, the Jets fired Bruce Koslet after 4 disastrous seasons and hired their own defensive coordinator, a 43-year-old Pete Carroll. Carroll was a fantastic defensive coordinator the year prior, as he led the Jets to the 6th best defense in terms of points allowed. And although he would lead the Jets to a mediocre 6-10 record in his first season as head coach, it really wasn't his fault. He was working with a past his prime boomer Esiason. Johnny Johnson was his starting running back, and if you don't know who that is, I don't blame you. And Rob Moore was his wide receiver 1, who granted was actually a pretty good player, but he didn't have his best years until he was in Arizona. But as I mentioned, it was just year 1 for Pete Carroll as a head coach, so maybe the team would develop him in his 2nd season. Just kidding, the Jets would fire Pete Carroll, who would go on to become one of the best coaches in both college football and professional football, in favor of Rich Kotite. Why was that? Because Leon Hess, the owner of the Jets at the time, was obsessed with him. He loved Rich Kotite because, to paraphrase Hess's words, he wanted to hire a winner, and he even named him the de facto general manager. So how would this work out? Well, over the next 2 years, Rich Kotite would win 4 games and went a combined 4-28 with the team. Oh yeah, he was also given general manager duties, so he drafted Kyle Brady over Hall of Famer Warren Sapp.
Oh, how we all wanted to believe that Leon Hess's bold move back in 1995 of firing Pete Carroll too soon and hiring Rich Kotite would turn this sad sack Jets franchise around. And oh, how we all ignored how the Eagles had just disintegrated under Kotite, losing 7 straight before he got another job with the Jets. That's the way it is when the new guy is introduced. That was then. This is now. Leon Hess is now 82, and another Jets coach bites the dust without a winning record.
Just to be clear, Rich Kotite wasn't like some sort of coaching guru before his time in New York. Sure, he had led the Eagles to a 10-win and an 11-win record during his first 2 seasons with the team, but he failed to even make the playoffs the next 2 seasons before getting hired. To make it even more apparent how bad Rich Kotite was, here's one of my favorite stories about him directly from an NBC affiliate back in 1991. The Eagles scored a touchdown with 5:27 left against their division rival Dallas Cowboys, cutting their deficit to 11 at 24-13. Against objections from his staff, Kotite went for a 2-point conversion. I could already imagine how people felt about this back then. Maybe Kotite was ahead of his time. Analytics! But the result was disastrous. Randall Cunningham was stopped short of the end zone, and afterwards, Kotite blamed the error on the weather. It was raining very heavily at the time, and we looked at the chart and we misread the chart. Kotite had a chart suggesting when an extra point should be kicked and when a 2-pointer should be attempted. But since there was no protective sheet on top of it, the ink ran in the rain. Like, dude, you are an NFL coach with your entire staff screaming at you to kick the extra point. But instead, since some rain messed up the ink on your play sheet, you decided to go for 2? I mean, I have so many questions. I mean, for one, how did the rain mess up the analytics that tell you when to go for 1 or 2? Like, you're telling me all the other notes are fine? And also, like, if it's all messed up, then why not ask your special teams coordinator? I really don't get it. This was the guy they ditched Pete Carroll for. And it would get way worse from here. After a short 2-year disastrous stint with the Jets, the franchise went in and hired an individual that would become the greatest head coach of all time, Bill Belichick. But it would only last for about 6 days. You see, Bill Belichick was Bill Parcells' prodigy as his defensive coordinator, but he wasn't the man the Jets wanted. The Jets wanted Bill Parcells. But since Parcells' contract with the Patriots stated that he could not coach anywhere else, the Jets hired Parcells as an advisor. But like, Come on, be serious. He wasn't hired as an advisor, he was hired to be the head coach behind the scenes. This was so obvious that the Patriots threatened legal action. But after NFL Commissioner Paul Tagliabue stepped in, he would broker a deal that would allow Parcells to become the next head coach of the Jets. But to make up for the stipulation in Parcells' contract, they would need to give up first, second, third, and fourth round picks.
I also am grateful, as Mr. Hess alluded to Bill Belichick for his support and confidence in me. And rest assured that'll be reciprocated in every way that I am able to do so for a long period of time for him.
Now, under Parcells and Belichick, the Jets would have a decent 1997 season. In 1998, the Jets would finally find success again as they went 12-4. They even made it all the way back to the AFC Championship game in 1998, only losing to the Denver Broncos, who could only be described as a super team that year. But it was over. The long decade-and-a-half wait for Jets fans was finally over, and the team was competitive again. Journeyman, former #1 overall pick Vinny Testaverde was finding his stride in New York. Newly acquired running back Curtis Martin was a bulldozer on the ground. Former #1 overall pick Keyshawn Johnson was finally showcasing his #1 overall talent. Bill Parcells was the grizzly old proven head coach, while Bill Belichick was the young up-and-coming coordinator who would take over the mantle when the time was right. Everything was going well, for one season that is. After the conference championship appearance, the Jets would go 8-8, and after just 3 years, Bill Parcells would step down as the head coach of the Jets and picked his boy wonder coordinator Bill Belichick to replace him. To date, Bill Parcells is the only Jets coach to leave the team with a winning record after coaching at least 2 seasons. Bill Belichick was next in line to lead the Jets, and even had his own press conference to announce the decision, but just 24 hours later, he would change his mind.
Due to the various uncertainties surrounding my position as it relates to the team's new ownership, I've decided to resign as the head coach of the New York Jets.
For reference, Bill Belichick literally wrote down on a napkin that I resign as head coach of the New York Jets. He didn't even have the decency to spell out head coach of the New York Jets. It was HC of the NYJ. And soon after, Belichick was announced as the next head coach of the New England Patriots. But since the Jets technically still had a contract with Belichick, things got a little strange. Once again, Commissioner Paul Tagliabue had to step in and brokered yet another deal between the Jets and Patriots that sent Belichick over to the Patriots for a future first round pick. But back to Belichick's original statement, he mentioned something about Jets' new ownership, and what he was referring to was Woody Johnson's massive purchase of the Jets for over $600 million. This was just 8 days before Belichick was announced as head coach of the Jets, so he probably felt that his job as head coach wasn't as secure as it would have been prior to the sale, but thus brought a brand new era of New York Jets football, the Woody Johnson era. To replace Bill Belichick, the New York Jets hired longtime Parcells assistant Al Groh, who, to be honest, wasn't a bad head coach. He led the team to a 9-8 record in his first season with the team, but resigned in favor of coaching the University of Virginia, which is kind of hilarious because in the span of 1 year, the Jets had Bill Parcells, Bill Belichick, and Al Groh all resign. Replacing Groh wasn't really easy though. After the 2001 season, Bill Parcells resigned from his position in the Jets front office, meaning there wasn't an elite football mind leading the team forward anymore. However, unlike the Jets of the past, they somehow made the right decision and hired Herm Edwards. Edwards was a local kid from New Jersey who, under Tony Dungy in Tampa, helped create one of the best defenses in the NFL. It also helped that they had Warren Sapp, the man Jets passed on a few years prior, and John Lynch, and Derek Brooks, but hey, let's give Herm his W. Edwards was one of the top head coaching candidates in the entire NFL, and Edwards would lead the Jets to the playoffs in his first 2 seasons, even winning the division in 2002. But more importantly, Chad Pennington, the Jets' first-round pick from 2 years prior, was ready to take the reins from Vinny Testaverde. In his first year starting in 2002, Chad Pennington was actually really good. He led the NFL in completion percentage, threw 22 touchdowns to just 6 interceptions, and led the Jets to their first division title since 1998. What this means is that since 1969, yes, you heard that correctly, 1969, the only 2 coaches to win their division for the Jets were Herm Edwards and Bill Parcells. So let's just recap where the Jets were after 2002. They had their head coach of the future in Herm Edwards, they had their quarterback of the future in Chad Pennington, new ownership in Woody Johnson, and had made the playoffs in back-to-back seasons for the first time since 1986. The Jets were back. It was time for them to take back New York from the Giants. So how do they follow up 2002 by going 6-10 and finishing last in their division. That's gotta be the most Jets thing ever. But to be fair to Herm Edwards, Chad Pennington did sustain a career-altering left wrist injury, which altered his elite play-action fake for the rest of his career. After the season, the New York Jets broke the bank and signed Chad Pennington to a record $64 million contract. The team was banking on the fact that he'd replicate his incredible 2002 season, but in classic Jets fashion, he'd sustain injury after injury to the point where after the 2005 season, despite not having his starting quarterback for a majority of games, the Jets traded Herm Edwards to the Chiefs in favor of hiring Eric Mangini. But before we move on from Herm Edwards, I do want to point out that his most memorable moment as the Jets head coach has to be this legendary response to a reporter.
This is what's great about sports. This is what the greatest thing about sports is. You play to win the game. Hello? You play to win the game. You don't play to just play it. That's the great thing about sports. You play to win. And I don't care if you don't have any wins. You go play to win. When you start telling me it doesn't matter, then retire. Get out. Because it matters.
Mangini had the honor of coaching Pennington's last non-injury plagued season with the Jets, but unfortunately, he was mediocre at best, which was kind of funny considering Mangini and the Jets somehow were able to go 10-6, meaning that if the Jets had any semblance of solid quarterback play, the team probably would have been at least able to win a single playoff game. Another reason this was funny is because this would be a sentiment Jets fans would have year after year. In fact, I can't think of a more Jets thing than saying our defense was great this year. Now, if we can find a quarterback, like, how down bad of a franchise do you have to be to have the best quarterback in your franchise's history play in the 1960s? The Browns at least had Brian Sipe and Bernie Kosar. The Bears at least had Jim McMahon and Jay Cutler. Hell, even the Vikings had Tommy Kramer and Dante Culpepper. The New York Jets were, and always have been, allergic to good quarterbacks. Even in Mangini's final season as the Jets head coach in 2008, they brought in Brett Favre, who threw 22 interceptions to 22 touchdowns. To make things funnier, after throwing 22 interceptions, the next season in Minnesota, Favre threw 33 touchdowns to 7 interceptions and finished 4th in MVP voting. The Jets were just not allowed to have a good quarterback, until 2009 that is.
I just knew that this is where I wanted to be. You know, I understand the pressures and the things like that go with the New York media and the expectations of a team coming off a 9-win season. I look at that as an opportunity, and an opportunity that we can win immediately.
Rex Ryan has to be the most non-New Yorker of all time. Like, I swear, you can just walk down Wall Street or go through Central Park and you'll find at least 10 guys who look and sound exactly like Rex Ryan. But more importantly, he was right. The Jets did win immediately. Rex Ryan was a key part of the mid-2000s legendary Ravens defense. He was a defensive coordinator there working with guys like Ray Lewis, Terrell Suggs, and Ed Reed, which, by the way, I also need to mention that the Jets also passed up on. But even without his Baltimore bullies, Rex Ryan was able to create his own New York nightmare. The 2009 Jets finished with the best defense in the NFL in terms of points allowed, yards allowed, first downs allowed. Basically, any defensive stat that you could imagine, the Jets were the best at. They had studs like Darrelle Revis, Sean Ellis, David Harris, Bart Scott, and wait a minute, besides Darrelle Revis, none of these guys were legendary, which makes it even more impressive how they had the best defense in football. So what about offensively? Well, let's just say rookie quarterback Mark Sanchez, who was drafted 5th overall in the NFL draft and was dubbed the Sanchez, threw 8 more interceptions than he did touchdowns. But that didn't stop the underdog Jets from making it all the way to the AFC Championship game, where they were simply outclassed by Peyton Manning's Colts. But in 2010, it was Jets time once again. Mark Sanchez could develop in the offseason. The Jets had an elite game-changing defense, and Rex Ryan had proven that he was capable of going deep in the playoffs. But this time, they weren't underdogs. Take it from Rex Ryan himself.
We got to have a great goddamn training camp, man. Last year, hey, we were under the radar. That's a good place to be. That. The best place to be is when expectations are high. Get used to it. It's always going to be that way.
I mean, the 2010 Jets were still a dominant force defensively. Sure, they regressed from the #1 defense in terms of yards allowed, but the offense took a significant step. They ranked top 13 in both points and yards, and Mark Sanchez finally threw more touchdowns than interceptions. I remember the offseason that this team was put together. I mean, they brought in a former top 5 pick in Braylon Edwards, had him team up with a Super Bowl hero in Santonio Santonio Holmes. They signed LaDainian Tomlinson, who was 31, but it's still LaDainian Tomlinson. I remember they also brought in Joy Taylor's brother. I mean, the hype surrounding the Jets this season was probably the most hype they've ever had in their franchise's history. Remember, Tomlinson was just 3 years removed from leading the NFL in yards and touchdowns, and the Jets would go 11-5 and would have won the division if they weren't in the same exact division as the New England Patriots and Tom Brady, who won MVP that season and led the Patriots to a 14-2 record. But honestly, it didn't matter, because in the divisional round that year, the New York Jets beat the New England Patriots by a touchdown to go back to the AFC Championship game.
Congratulations. See you in Pittsburgh. Can't wait.
For that week, between the divisional round and the AFC Championship game, it felt like the decades of suffering that Jets fans had felt were gone. For the first time in franchise history, the New York Jets had made it to back-to-back conference championship game appearances, and did it by defeating the man that left a napkin to resign from their head coaching position. But unfortunately, it was all for naught, as they were beaten by the Steelers 24-19. After this loss, on paper, or should I say napkin, there was no reason to think that the Jets couldn't be back. I mean, Mark Sanchez looked like he was developing. The team won more games than a year prior, and Darrelle Revis was the best cornerback in football. There was just one problem. The defense regressed. Mark Sanchez had his best year as a starter, finally being able to break the 20 touchdown mark, but the defense tanked to 20th in points allowed, allowing the Jets to finish 8-8. But there was still hope. This has to be a fluke, right? The Jets had finally looked competitive for the first time since the Parcells era. However, unfortunately for Jets fans, it all came crashing down in 2012. They finished 6-10. Darrelle Revis, the main heart and soul of the team, tore his ACL just 2 games into the season. There was conclusive evidence to also indicate that Mark Sanchez was a colossal bust. In 4 years, despite playing in 2 AFC Championship games, the most memorable thing about him was a moment dubbed the butt fumble, where he just runs into his center's butt and fumbles the ball in a 30-point blowout loss to the Patriots. To be honest, the rest of Rex Ryan's tenure was less than memorable as well. He lost his defensive star via a trade, he had to try and develop Geno Smith, who was drafted in the 2nd round, and after finishing 4-12 in 2014, he was fired in favor of Todd Bowles. But at least there was something to look forward to. Geno Smith had flashes, and maybe Todd Bowles, a veteran coordinator who had been in the NFL for 15 years, could teach him a thing or two. That was the dream, until this happened.
All right, back live here inside training camp, live on the field with some breaking news out of Florham Park, New Jersey and Jets training camp. Geno Smith out 6 to 10 weeks with a broken jaw as a result, as Todd Bowles has just said, of a sucker punch from one of his teammates, and that player has been released.
Yeah, so in case you had doubts about the New York Jets curse, Geno Smith got his jaw broken from a punch thrown by one of his teammates. Seriously, that's what happened. This isn't some fake script to get him out of games. He actually got his jaw broken by one of his teammates. But as a result, a legend would be born. The first-year head coach had to go with veteran Ryan Fitzpatrick to lead the Jets into 2015, and here's the wild part, it worked. The Jets went 10-6 with the defense finishing 4th in yards allowed, and the offense finishing 10th in total yards. Ryan Fitzpatrick had the best season of his career, throwing 31 touchdowns to 15 interceptions. Chris Ivory made the first Pro Bowl of his career at 27 years old with 7 touchdowns in over 1,000 yards. And Brandon Marshall was named an All-Pro, leading the NFL in touchdowns with 14 and hauling in over 1,500 yards. Newly signed Eric Decker contributed to bringing in 12 touchdowns and over 1,000 yards, and defensively they were stacked. They had Demario Davis, Muhammad Wilkerson, Antonio Cromartie, Sheldon Richardson, Leonard Williams, David Harris, and they even managed to bring back Darrelle Revis for one last dance. But unfortunately, that last dance somehow wasn't in the cards for this absolutely stacked team. They finished with 10 wins, but that still wasn't enough to make the playoffs in a stacked AFC that year. But they still had all that talent going into the 2016 season, so you would think they'd be able to improve upon a 10-win season. Well, no, because all the names that I listed were off the team by 2016 except for Leonard Williams, who was still on a rookie contract. As quickly as Jets fans were given a star-studded team, it was quickly taken away from them through an inept front office. Needless to say, the Todd Bowles era was a complete mess after this, with the Jets going through quarterbacks like paper towel rolls. They had Ryan Fitzpatrick, Bryce Petty, Geno Smith, and Josh McCown. But in 2016, 2017 and 2018, the final 2 seasons of Todd Bowles' tenure as the Jets head coach, he was given a gift. The New York Jets had drafted Jamal Adams and Sam Darnold with their first-round picks. These two players were supposed to anchor the Jets offensively and defensively, and for the most part, at least Jamal Adams did. Jamal Adams was named an All-Pro 3 times out of the first 4 years of his career, and Sam Darnold was, well,
seen ghosts.
So yeah, that's how the Todd Bowles era ended, and they decided to bring in a head coach that was an offensive guru to help Sam Darnold develop. And in came Adam Gase with one of the creepiest introductory press conferences we've ever seen in NFL history.
Well, over 3 years, you're going to have mistakes that you make, and really, it could be either a mental note or really you start creating that list from year to year. And it's really started in this first part of the process.
Okay, ignore what he's saying and just focus on his eyes. Like, come on, be real. This is not a serious person. I'm not really going to touch on the Adam Gase era in New York because I genuinely feel like this man should not have gotten this job at all. Let's just evaluate Adam Gase's resume for a second. 0 playoff wins, just 1 winning season. His 2 good seasons as an offensive coordinator came with Peyton Manning, a man known to create his own offenses, and when he left Peyton, his own team ranked 21st in yards and 23rd in points. Let's not even talk about how Ryan Tannehill turned into one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL in Tennessee the moment he got away from Adam Gase. There's absolutely no reason Adam Gase should have even sniffed the head coaching position for the Jets, but they're so cursed and inept that of course he got the job. And in that short time, he completely ruined Sam Darnold. So needless to say, the 2-year stint Adam Gase spent in New York was a complete unmitigated disaster. Also, I do think that it's funny that after Sam Darnold left New York, he completely rebuilt his entire career in Minnesota years later. After that, the Jets would move on to Robert Saleh, who looked like a genuine head coach in the NFL. He had built some dominant defenses with the 49ers, and he did the same thing in New York. Are you starting to see a theme here? The Jets consistently bring in a defensive-minded head coach that has a solid resume. The coach does a great job building a solid defense, but is lacking a quarterback in order to find true success. And you would think it'd be different this time with Robert Saleh, but no. The Jets came really close to being able to draft Trevor Lawrence with the #1 overall pick in the 2021 NFL Draft, but they decided to have a moral victory against the Los Angeles Rams and tanked to #2. As a result, instead of deciding to draft any of the other incredible players in the 2021 NFL Draft, like Penei Sewell or Jamar Chase or Micah Parsons, they decided to draft yet another project quarterback in Zach Wilson. Now, in Zach Wilson's rookie season, I will admit he had no help, but in his second year, the Jets had one of the best drafts that we've ever seen in New York Jets history. This is a season that they brought in Garrett Wilson, Sauce Gardner, Jermaine Johnson, and Breece Hall. I mean, I've never seen a draft class like this. You would think that their general manager would get job security for life for pulling this off. And in 2022, the defense skyrocketed to top 5 in most categories, but the offense was horrible under Zach Wilson. The Jets were in a familiar position that they had been in many times prior. They felt like the roster was built perfectly, and the only thing they needed was a quarterback to push them into contention. And as a result, they traded for Aaron Rodgers, a 4-time MVP, Super Bowl MVP, and debatably one of the quarterbacks of all time. Let me set the scene for the opening day of 2023. It's the anniversary of 9/11. The New York Jets had never had this much hope in their entire franchise's history since Joe Namath was on the team. Here comes Aaron Rodgers running out of the tunnel with an American flag. The curse was broken! This was pure cinema. Then, a few plays into the game, and Aaron Rodgers tore his Achilles. If you had not bought into the curse of the New York Jets up until this point, how can you not anymore? Are you kidding me? This has to be a sick joke. What the actual hell? It goes without saying that Rodgers had to rehab the entire season. And after another season of Zach Wilson, the Jets were forced to trade him because he regressed even further. And honestly, I would regress too if Nathaniel Hackett was my offensive coordinator. Now this brings us to the modern day, the 2024 season. We have completely recapped the entire curse of the New York Jets. But is it really a curse? Well, no, it's not. As we all know, the 2024 New York Jets were somehow even worse with Aaron Rodgers than they were with Zach Wilson. Sure, offensively, Rodgers was putting up better numbers, but as a team, they finished just 5-12, with their offense somehow finishing 8 possessions lower in points scored, and that's after trading for future Hall of Famer Davante Adams. Oh yeah, and Robert Saleh was fired mid-season, and soon after that happened, the elite defense of the Jets tanked into one of the worst units in the entire NFL. Now, the Jets have told Aaron Rodgers they don't want him back for the 2025 season, season, which is funny considering just 2 years ago, they were on their hands and knees begging for this man to save their franchise. But as for Aaron Glenn, the man who was just hired to become the next head coach of the New York Jets, I don't know if I have much hope. Listen, I'm not saying Aaron Glenn is going to fail. Who knows? Maybe he's the one to turn this horrid franchise around. But if you just take a look at this team's history with defensive coordinators who are hired as head coaches, it starts all the way back with Bill Belichick, who resigned after one day, to Al Groh, who resigned after 1 year, to Eric Mangini, Rex Ryan, Todd Bowles, and Robert Saleh. But here's the thing, I don't think any of those guys are to blame. I mean, just take a look at what happens to each of these coaches once they leave the Jets. Bill Belichick leaves, becomes the greatest head coach of all time. Chad Pennington leaves, then leads the Dolphins to the playoffs. Brett Favre leaves, finishes 4th in MVP, and leads the Vikings to the NFC Championship. Darrelle Revis leaves, and he goes on and wins a Super Bowl with the New England Patriots. Geno Smith leaves, and years later is a Pro Bowler leading the Seahawks to the playoffs. Todd Bowles leaves and has cemented himself as a long-term Buccaneers head coach. Sam Darnold leaves and years later has the single best individual season by a Minnesota Vikings quarterback in franchise history. Hell, even Robert Saleh leaves mid-season and is hired by the Packers as a consultant and helps lead them to the playoffs in one of the most stacked divisions in the NFL. Are you noticing a trend here? Everyone that leaves the Jets gets better. So what's the constant? The Jets. The Jets are the constant. More specifically, the ownership of the Jets. Remember Leon Hess, the guy who owned the Jets before Woody Johnson? He was born in Asbury Park, New Jersey. And not only did he love New York sports, he loved football. So when he had the chance to be part of the group that bought the Jets in 1963, he was jumping over the moon with excitement, especially when he became the sole owner years later. But remember a few more things. He personally fired Pete Carroll after one mediocre year for a head coach who didn't know whether to kick an extra point or go for two because there was some water on his notes. He chose not to re-sign the Derrick Henry of the 80s and John Riggins. You can directly connect Leon Hess to multiple decisions over the years that made the New York Jets a bad football team, even going as far as moving the team's stadium from New York City to East Rutherford, New Jersey. Like, come on, dude, what are you thinking? As for Woody Johnson, the man he sold the team to, well, just listen to this.
And then you find out that they were going to trade for Jerry Jeudy, who I think has 1,000 receiving yards for the Browns. They were going to trade with the Broncos, and then Woody Johnson, I think, found out from his sons that Jerry Jeudy didn't have a good Madden rating. So they didn't make the trade.
You think that's bad? Listen to what else Woody Johnson is letting his 18-year-old Brick Johnson do in the locker room. According to Diana Rossini, this past Halloween, the Jets registered their first victory since Robert Saleh's firing 4 weeks earlier. It was a significant moment for a struggling team. Aaron Rodgers walked into an energized locker room with a game ball in hand, and it was expected that he was going to give the ball to Jeff Ulbrich, a customary gesture when a coach gets his first NFL win. But before Rodgers could speak, Woody Johnson's teenage son, Brick Johnson, took another game ball and awarded it to Garrett Wilson. In an exchange, the owner's son later posted to Instagram, "That was one of the best fucking catches I've seen in my entire life." Johnson said it in a reference to an acrobatic catch that Wilson made in game. Garrett fucking Wilson. Woody then gave Ulbrich the ball that Rodgers had been holding. Multiple players said that the energy felt drained out of the room. I'm sorry, is this a real football team? You cannot be serious. But a small side note, imagine being Aaron Rodgers, a guy who played in small town Green Bay, Wisconsin for nearly 2 decades, a team that has no owner, and unknowingly going into a mess like this. Also, I'm sorry, but if I'm Jeff Ulbrich, and after decades of being in the NFL, my moment is ruined by some 18-year-old trust fund child who goes to Harvard, I'm walking out, not just on the locker room, but my job. Are you kidding me? Granted, the Garrett Wilson catch was pretty amazing, but why is an 18-year-old who just started his freshman year at college directing team acquisitions and leading post-game locker room speeches just so he can flex it on Instagram? It seems to me that Woody Johnson is the issue here, not the countless players, executives, and coaches who have churned through the Jets since he bought the franchise over 20 years ago. He is. This mess will not be fixed until one of two things happen. Either Woody Johnson steps back and doesn't make any decisions and just lets people knowledgeable on football make the decisions, or he just sells the team. Look at the Commanders. They were terrible under Dan Snyder's tenure, but as soon as he sells the team, they're competent once again, and they made it all the way to the NFC Championship. I really don't know any other solution to this systemic issue that the New York Jets have. It's a shame, honestly, because the New York Jets play in a huge market. They have loyal, devoted fans who show up week in and week out, but because their ownership is so inept, they have nothing to show for the decades of loyalty. I genuinely hope in the near future that Woody Johnson can find the self-respect to do either of those two solutions. Until then, I see no future in which the New York Jets can sustain a competitive window. The New York Jets are cursed, but not by some mysterious mysterious person. They're cursed by terrible ownership. If you guys enjoy this type of content, make sure you drop a like and check out our other content that I'll leave in the end screen. Aside from that, I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.